Hello all, I hope you're doing well. This video is going to be more for the purists, the people that really want to get to the heart of what it is I believe about traditionalism, the Western world, and the potential positive future, the post-ideological future, I should say. Now, this is bringing together lots of my thoughts and many different questions people have asked me in one big video. And I first of all want to speak about this idea of being post-ideological. I know that can seem somewhat ironic, given I'm a quote right-wing YouTuber. But as I've often tried to point towards, the tradition itself and traditionalism as a philosophical understanding is meta-political. It's also multi-dimensional. That means that you can't really just simply bracket it into right-wing thought or left-wing thought or centrist thought. And it's multi-dimensional because it speaks to spiritual elements of human beings which are beyond the political. It speaks on the cultural level as well. And of course on the personal level, about how we live our lives, how we form healthy communities. Now, as you'll know, I believe a tradition is vital. It's the sort of narrative, the mythological structure that's been built over time with, if you like, often a sacred core, pardon me, and that's often made unique by a given group in a given time. You could argue, European Christendom is different to African Christendom, although they're both rooted in Christianity. You could even argue there are splinter groups within that, Anglicanism and the Catholic Church and so on. I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but you understand the broader point. A certain group over time makes something uniquely theirs that becomes their culture. Therefore, it has spiritual elements, biological elements, cultural elements, national elements, and so on. And if you remove this structure, which we're doing in the Western world, you'll find things get increasingly uncertain and chaotic. And of course, it goes without saying at the top of the video, I know I myself can fall into some of the traps that I'm pointing to here with regards to ideology. The tradition itself would tell me, you're fallen, you're not perfect, you should try and improve where you can, you're going to have blind spots. But in principle, human beings are never going to be able to fulfill the totality of the tradition, but we should try. And this is why when some people say, I disagree with this one point you make and so on, that's fine. We're always going to have our disagreements. None of us are perfect. This is also why I've been very eager to explore and explain modernity through the lens of the masculine and feminine energies. As I've said many times, these are core energies in manifest life. You'll get this at the heart of every single culture, Rama and Sita, the yin and yang, Adam and Eve, and so on. And this is because they act as the foundational understanding of how we understand each other. Now, I've also said that in the modern West, these masculine and feminine energies broadly, not completely airtightly, but broadly map on to the right and left wing. Now, that's not meant to be insulting by saying, the left wing is feminine. It's supposed to be a reading of how the energetics of that movement display itself in our political reality. So, again, the cliche would be the right wing tends to focus on law and order. Boundaries, classically masculine. In any culture, you'll find it's the men who lay down the boundaries. It's also very focused on expansion on the right. It likes to go out, explore new things, find new ground, advance. Classically masculine again. And it tends to focus more on harsh truths and brute force data. Harsh truths such as people aren't equal in life. It's a classic right-wing line that hierarchy is normal and natural. I'd actually agree with that. That not everybody is going to be born exactly the same and it's just simply the world which defines what you are. I'm not saying that, our environments don't shape us at all. Of course they do, to a certain extent. But it also seems clear to me that not everybody's going to be born to be Cristiano Ronaldo or Napoleon. Some people are just born with innate talents and skills, and it makes sense that they top given hierarchies. And in fact, we should look up to certain people, especially good men who are initiated into the tradition, because they can act as leading lights that can guide us and initiate us down the line as well. Of course, the left, on the counter case, tends to focus more around ideas of liberation. It tends to focus more on compassion and empathy. And it seems to focus on breaking what it sees as unjust boundaries. That's a classic motif of the left, especially in the 20th century. You see this a lot in the mainstream liberal media, such and such a pop star is breaking boundaries. Of course they're not. It's normally Harry Styles. He's wearing a dress. That's the opposite of breaking boundaries. But this is getting into a broader topic. They're stuck in the ideology of leftism rather than the reality of it. And again, leftism, if you look at its broader ideas, tends to focus more on utopianism, socialism and so on, communism, whereas the right tends to be more religious in a sense. You could argue the left is more spiritual, the right's more religious in the sense of thinking, look, we're not going to get this heavenly experience on earth now. It might come after. It might be something we can look to in God, but the world itself is fallen. The left tends to view more, or try to push more towards equality. It views that as somehow possible. And again, I would say arguably that's not even ideological to an extent. I think some people are almost genetically wired that way. But again, that's a side point. The broader point I'm making here is we can understand reality through these frames. And of course, as I like to speak about on the channel, this means if they have a light side, they both have a shadow side. And liberal modernity, I would say, has a more spiritually feminine energy. And I often say we can see this by how it speaks about masculinity. As I've said before, you very rarely see masculinity spoken about in a positive way today. It's either described as toxic on the one side, that would be bordering on the classic masculine capacities of bravery, stoicism, etc., etc., although it often explains it through the shadow forms of tyranny. Or it will, if it's seen in a good light, it will be aping femininity. Oh, I'm emotional, I'm sharing my feelings, I'm not toxic like those other guys. And as I've said many times, I get it. I'm doing the 7 steps with guys right now. I understand that there is space in life to share what's going on. I get that. But the problem is if you leave men there, you're treating them like women. And what men very often need are journeys of action that they can grow through. Again, the classic masculine archetypal journey is going through challenge and evolving. That's what men are meant to do. Women don't really have those same journeys. Nature brings challenge to them in the form of the period and pregnancy and so on. It's almost inbuilt, their challenges. Men have to go out into the world and find the challenge. If they don't, they get sick and unwell and all sorts of mental health issues and addictions, which has happened in the West. But again, I don't want to get too lost on side issues. The broader point here is that liberal modernity has really made masculinity almost meaningless. Like I say, it's either toxic on the one side, and I'm not saying there are never legitimate examples of that, some cruel person whose son's going through hellish depression and just says shut up or whatever. I'm sure that exists, but it's a minority. It's massively overblown for liberal reasons or liberal propaganda reasons. The point is that because we've lost our tradition, we have no counter case to say, well, actually, no, the strong, wise, loving masculine force is this. Historically, that would be the church. Explored this many times, though. The church doesn't really care about these issues anymore. Broadly speaking, the Anglican Church is more fussed about impressing the Guardian and LGBTQ and the rest of it. Whereas the men in the society now, because they don't have that line, have kind of gone off into the world of the city, pleasure seeking, money, coke and hookers, so to speak. That's a joke, but it's only a semi-joke. What I mean is they're chasing the pleasures of the world. They don't really have a higher purpose any longer. And of course, what this means is that without that real, if you like, loving, wise father figure to guide the culture and guide men, the left is completely dominant, or you could say the feminine spirit is very dominant, expressing itself as the loving principle. It's why many men can't bear the word love now. They think, oh God, not another lecture about whatever intersectionality is this week to do with trans or gays or whatever racial group the left deciding to make a big fuss about. But again, the point is that this is why in our mainstream political system that everything just veers left. It's because the power structures are left. I mean, even Reform are veering left. Even did this in a video earlier, J.K. Rowling saying they've gone woke, and people on the right will say they're a left-wing party and so on. But what we often forget in modernity is that, of course, the masculine does have a shadow, but it just gets annoying because it's all it focuses on. And what really needs to come through is the masculine light, I would say, in a traditionalist context. But by that same standard, we should acknowledge that the feminine has a shadow as well. Of course, it has a light side, compassion and care. That sort of stuff can be an element of Christ, not the whole of Christ, of course, which modern Christianity tends to ignore. Caring for the vulnerable is a very noble thing to do, again, unless it becomes ideological. But the shadow side of the left, as I'm sure many of us have experienced, tends to veer into quite an unhealthy energy. Very often people use it for narcissistic reasons. leftist ideology becomes an avatar for own personal problems. They're having challenges getting on in life. Well, it's not me, it's the system. It's white privilege or white men or whatever else it is, capitalism. And again, as I say, it's not like these other things are never problems. It's when you make them an ideology, if you like, to explain reality to yourself, it becomes a problem. And we've seen this really explode in the Western world in recent years. We've moved away from acknowledging the harsh truths of life and prefer sort of utopian stories we can tell ourselves. And increasingly we move closer and closer towards anarchy and chaos because of that. But as I hope that you're grasping when we have this understanding, it's not that the right is always correct and the left is always wrong. That's not what I'm saying. They're universal energies, properly understood, or really they're microcosms of universal energies that can be in a fullness, in a light form, or they can be in a sick form. Now, I believe at the moment we're dominated by a more, like I say, spiritual feminine energy, which is getting a bit sick. And it's almost craving deep down the real driving light masculine energy to come back through. And I think it will eventually. Like I said in a recent video, civilizations, these energies tend to work in cycles. But the point is that the left and right, ironically, like men and women, need each other. You can't have one without the other. In fact, they depend upon one another. And we've moved away from our tradition, so we fail to understand, or we fail to have a harmony between these two forces in this day and age. So they're constantly in conflict rather than ideally complementing one another, which would be the sort of traditional yin-yang thing. Now, as I've said many times, and this is very unpopular, I'm sure, with many of the libtypes, the masculine leads the dance. You find this cross-culturally. I also think it's true once you start to get into interpersonal relationships with women. They won't respect you if you don't have the capacity to lead. Even if they say the radical feminists, don't listen to what they say, watch the behavior. They don't respect men who won't lead. And I often say we have to challenge the way that liberal ideological modernity interprets that. It would say, oh, this is just toxic men. They want to tell you what to do all the time. They're bullies. And again, of course, you can find that shadow side of men. But the tradition, patriarchy itself, isn't promoting that. It's a misunderstanding. Patriarchy is something more like, or the traditional understanding of the interaction of the masculine and feminine is something more like a dance, I often describe it as. So you have like the famous Latin dances, and you'll see the male always leads, and the feminine actually loves the masculine leadership in that context. And it's not because he's pulling her around and telling her what to do. What he's actively doing is showing that he is with the rhythm. And when you're with the rhythm, the woman will naturally follow it. It's a beautiful magnetic capacity that happens. And it's almost irresistible to the woman. And the man feels in his fullness when he's doing it. Now, if we're to take this analogy one step further, the rhythm is something more like, you could say in religious language, God's energy. Truth, justice, light. You're aligned with a pure sense of being. Something that the modernist liberals would not understand or have any sympathy for, because the masculine's always sort of evil in their eyes. But broadly speaking, what you'd be exhibiting through the masculine context is almost caring leadership, the energy of the wise king. Men need to look to that in order to initiate them, to evolve them. Women, whether they admit it or not, and feminine energy itself actually craves that energy of the masculine. It can't help it. I may have given you this example before, but when I was studying all this leftist nonsense as a youngster, doing critical theory, I realised that the women in the class still liked the brightest, the most confident Marxists. So even though we were speaking about, how gender's a construct, you could still see the underlying realities of universal energy were still at play. The lefty women want the dominant lefty men. You'll always find this. It's human nature, no matter what your ideology is. So, as I say, once we start to understand things through this context, this more universal traditionalist context, we can understand the left and right through a new dynamic. And hopefully that can allow us to look at ourselves and let go of some of our own angers and resentments towards the left, which is very important if we're to advance. I'm not saying they're not right to have disagreements. I'm saying if they're rooted in an anger where we want to win, we're kind of losing ourselves. I think when we look at the left through this frame, we can almost have an empathy for how it's got lost a little bit, especially Western women who in my eyes, they've been deeply corrupted, and it's really sad what's happening and is going to happen. But we can also see that, elements of the left are noble, at least in my eyes. Things like caring for animals, that's a noble cause. Caring for nature, that's a noble cause. I know it can turn into a pseudo-religion, fair enough on that. But in and of itself, it's a noble cause. And again, like I said earlier, the care for the poor is a noble cause. The care for the vulnerable, is a noble cause. But as I say, the future can't just be, we've got to defeat the other side, because then we'll just be almost too in our masculine. We'll be too much in the opposing energy now, and everything will just kick back eventually. We'll be stuck in the dialectic, to use political language. What I would say needs to happen, and for the next stage, of our advancement, and I know this is grand language, but what else does the West do at this point? It feels that we almost need to die to these ideologies and be almost reborn in a deeper traditionalist understanding, which is massively evolved for a new era, where we integrate the lessons of both left and right into a broader transcendent purpose. That would be almost like the rebirth of Western civilization in some context. We'll be able to have certain lessons from the past, but we've taken on a new energy, which will come in new understandings of who we are, what we are, and ideally with that, a better life for all involved. Now, I think this is a lot easier to understand when we look at this helpful graph I saw someone posted recently. And they've mapped on the 7 deadly sins to the political left-right dynamic, or authoritarian-libertarian, if you look at the top and bottom there as well. And I thought this was really, really a good example of what I'm trying to get at in this. It's not scientific, but it's really good to understand this stuff. So again, you can see on the right, the top right, which would be the right wing, the far right, quote unquote, wrath is the sin that you have to struggle with there. And it's very interesting because this is maps on exactly to the liberal criticism, if you like, of the right, especially the quote far right. Oh, it's angry, it's hateful. And like I've said, you can find some truth in that. That's why I always say on the main channel, don't go into the shadow side. You can have the light side of being right wing, which is something more like justice, truth, order. That's normally aligned with more religious traditions. Not for everyone, but broadly speaking it is. But the point is, this is how the left conceptualizes, or the liberals, I should say, really, conceptualize the right in order to maintain their dominance. Of course, what they ignore is they have their own shadow sides. And we see this, across the spectrum for every area. Now, I'm not going to go into every single one because the video will start getting too long, but let's just look at something like envy in order to understand this. Resentment. This is classic on the authoritarian sort of socio-communist left. I mean, famously, the kulaks, the Soviets destroyed the middle-class kulaks, And with that, was it Mao? Didn't he have this campaign against destroying the bourgeois, who he saw as anybody with glasses and things like that? It's the envy of those that are perceived as above. And remember, I was saying earlier, the right will often acknowledge hierarchy and say it actually can be noble. We can need hierarchy to guide us. The left tends to be the opposite. We do not want hierarchy, views it as evil. Everything is nurture, so it needs to be destroyed. But very often there's an envy beneath that. An envy against nature for making someone 6'4" and stronger or brighter or whatever it is. Because what we end up doing is destroying everything and trying to create a totally even level. What we do is we create hell instead. And it's ironic, actually, because you even see this in some of the more liberal movies of the age. I remember this growing up. You see this with the teen movies. Very often you'll find that the jock type character, who is 6'4", and has got muscles coming out of his ears, and he's clever, and the girls like him, will kind of be the bad guy in most of these teen movies. And the ethic of the movie will be something like, the jock gets made a fool out of. Stacey really likes the jock, but then she realizes, he's actually full of wrath and anger. All he is his shadow side. That's all that there is to him. And then somewhere along the line, I don't know, they feed him a laxative and he poos himself in the test and Stacey laughs and all that sort of stuff. Or alternatively, you get some of these movies where the jock will go up to the nerd and, be like, yeah, you know what, nerd dweeb, you really showed me what it means to be a real man, and here's my hand, buddy, and shake his hand, and you deserve Stacey, you go get a pal, that sort of thing. And then the pop punk starts, what's my age again? What's my age again? And it's all this feel-good stuff, but really it's just the fantasy. You can imagine the writers were the nerds at school who were losing the girl to the jock, because that's reality. It was only like lemons like me who believed this horse shit growing up. When you're 18 and you got no masculine figures around you, no masculine culture to guide you, you believe this crap. And then you go and try it with the women, be like, nerd dweeb, and they all of a sudden are like, oh, I love you as a friend. And you think, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I'm doing everything the culture tells me. It took me to my mid-20s to realise it was all horse shit. I got to the point where I was like, I'm just giving up. I'll just focus on my own life, try and build a career. And I probably just won't have a girlfriend. And as soon as I started to do that, they're interested in you. And again, I know now is because I was finally exhibiting masculine qualities. Mission focused, not complaining, not needy, that sort of thing. And of course, then I started to read about it and be like, oh, women like the jocks. They like masculine men because they're naturally magnetically drawn to masculine energy, no matter what they say. Anyway, the point that I'm getting at here is we have to start understanding things in a broader context if we really are to move beyond this. And the mission here isn't to destroy these sides. It's not to deny them, but to almost re-understand the power of a broader traditionalist understanding and escape ideological identification. If we can't do that, we're going to stay locked in modernity. And I often say on the sister channel, The Sacred Way, it's all about personal and spiritual transformation. If you want to advance, you have to sacrifice things in the spiritual life. Whatever it is, it might be your dreams of wealth, it might be a woman. There's always some challenge that we'll be called to. And it feels like this is a challenge for the West, We have to get over these endless spats online of wanting to win, wanting to look good. You get this on the left and the right, all these gotchas. Gotchas don't prove anything. You can make anyone look stupid, for 5 minutes. It's easy to do. The real mission here, I think, for the Western world is to overcome these limitations. I'm not saying it's wrong to have your beliefs. I have conservative beliefs in the modernist frame. They are a bit broader than that, properly understood. Some would veer into the left, some harder right. A bit all over the place. But broadly speaking, it's more conservative. But the point is, it's almost in the understanding how we're all supposed to, in an ideal context, work off each other. Like the yin and yang, it's supposed to flow together. You're supposed to hear the compassionate voice of the feminine. If we don't hear it, it gets angry, it gets ideological. And if the masculine principle is destroyed by, I would say, envious actors in their shadow, then that voice really starts to dominate and you get radical feminism and so on. So the point is, it's understanding the broader context of the tradition, going to the next stage, which I think is really at the heart of what I'm trying to point towards here. I'm not saying I can do it alone, but it just seems to me that the modern political spectrum we have, the modern ideological understanding, is just not speaking to the depth of reality and the depths that we come from. So, as I often say, I think the West is, or liberalism more accurately, is in a process of dying. And as we go through that death, it will point to a deeper understanding of who and what we are. When chaos strikes, you have two options. You die in the anarchy and the mess, you get destroyed by it, or you're reborn as an evolved version of what you are. And again, that's the classic masculine motif. I speak about that all the time on the sister channel. Check it out down below, as I say. But the point is, it feels to me that this is what Western man is being called to at this point. I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow, but it feels like this century, this is the big challenge of the century. Can we move beyond this, a re-understanding of who we truly are on our root level? I'll be interested to know what you think about this. It's helpful for me to explore some of these ideas in full because I've never really done it. As I say, I'm sure this video is going to be more for the purists, so I'll be interested in your responses. As always, do feel free to reach out to me, join the Substack, join the Sacred Way channel as well, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do subscribe if you know. Take care.